Well, we are continuing our series through Mark's Gospel. And in this session, we're going to be looking at Mark chapter 5, the beginning, really, of Mark chapter 5. And in this particular portion of Mark's Gospel, we see a story of a man who understood what Jesus had done for him. The question that I would ask us, and I really want you to think about this and reflect on it, is, do you understand what Jesus has done for you? I mean, do you really understand what Jesus has done for you? You know, honestly, we're not too good at realizing how indebted we are to others. As a matter of fact, we really don't want to owe other people. We really don't want to admit that we need other people. When Cade was 5, we were looking for something for Lindsay for Mother's Day. And as we were looking for cards and that sort of thing, I told Cade, I said, Cade, you're going to need to write something to your mom and tell her how much you appreciate her, the things that she does for you all the time. Just think about how much she does. And I was trying to tell him and help him to realize all the things that Lindsay does for him. And I said, can you think of things that your mom does for you that you could acknowledge and just tell her how much you appreciate that? And he thought for a while, and finally he said, well, Dad, all I can think of is that she makes me chocolate milk. And that's true. Certainly, though, Lindsay does many, many other things, as most mothers do for their children. But for him, that's all he could think about. She makes me chocolate milk. But I think it's important for us to pause and really reflect on what God has done for us, and particularly what Jesus has done for us on the cross. And so we have to ask that question of ourselves: do I really understand what Jesus has done for me? You know, Jesus was just coming off of the Sea of Galilee when we get into chapter 5. And the end of chapter 4 is a very interesting story where Jesus had been in the boat with his disciples, and there was the great storm that came up. And we see Jesus saying, "Peace, be still." The disciples are terrified, not really by what they see and what Jesus does, though I'm sure that brought some fear within them because of his power. But they were terrified because of the storm. They believed that they were going to die. But Jesus says, "Peace, be still." And the sea, if you can use your imagination, became like glass, like a mirror, just complete calm. And the question is asked by the disciples. They think to themselves or question among themselves, who can this be that even the wind and the sea obey him? And that's the story that Mark tells leading into chapter 5. Now I want to begin reading this story. It's chapter 5, verses 1 down through 14. So follow along with me as I read. They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain, for he had often been bound with shackles and chains, but he wrenched the chains apart, he broke the shackles in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day, among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. And when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him. And crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he was saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. And now a great herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside, and they begged him, saying, "Send us to the pigs, let us enter them." And so he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs and the herd, the herd numbering about 2,000 rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned in the sea. And then verse 14, the herdsmen fled, and they told it in the city, in the country, and people came to see what it was that had happened. I'm not sure that we could fully imagine what this must have been like. Some suggested that it must have looked pretty humorous. Others have admitted that indeed swine can be, followers, and so when one does something, the others do it. I think this is just simply the power and the majesty of Jesus. I want you to think about this story again. Okay, so this man came out and met Jesus. This man was really a monster of sorts. He lived in the tombs. He was chained, but no one could keep him bound. He kept breaking the chains. He would break the shackles. He was always crying out. He was always cutting himself with stones. You can imagine what he must have looked like. I'm sure he looked terrifying to all the people around. And when he rushed out, I'm sure the disciples, while we're not told this, I'm sure there was fear in their eyes. But not for Jesus, because Jesus knew exactly what was going on. And so the demons, they come out and they say, we are many, we're legion. That's what we're called. We call this man legion, though it's the demons that are actually identified as legion, for we are many, they say. Jesus calling the unclean spirits out of this man, but they respond in the very same way that those evil spirits or unclean spirits in Mark chapter 1 respond. They acknowledge who Jesus is. They know very clearly who he is. And they beg him not to harm them. And the same happens, as I said, in Mark chapter 1. We see it in verse 24. We see it here in Mark chapter 5. And so the unclean spirits know exactly who Jesus is. And so the demons, they want to not be cast out of the country, but rather, but are asking Jesus really for mercy. And Jesus sends them into the swine. The swine run down the hill into the sea and drown. Can you imagine being one of the herdsmen, going back and telling the boss what happened to the herd of swine, the number of about 2,000? I mean, this was a pretty large herd. Can you imagine going back and telling the boss, hey, this is what happened? Do you think the boss would have believed that? Seems rather outlandish, doesn't it? But quickly, a crowd comes out to see what had happened. The reality is that this is a story about the power and the majesty of this man named Jesus. The man who we call Legion understood the significance of what Jesus had done for him. Sometimes it's difficult for us to remember where we were and where we are now in Christ. Sometimes we don't like to think about where we were. But I think it's important for us to do that so that we can come to an understanding of all that Jesus has done for us. I believe that this man who we call Legion, I believe he understood fully what Jesus had done for him. I mean, can you imagine living out in the tombs, being possessed by these unclean spirits, where you are constantly crying out, constantly cutting yourselves with stones, rather, not knives, but stones, and you think about what that must have been like to now having Jesus cast the unclean spirit out of you. And now you are, as we could continue reading the story, clothed and in your right mind. Can you imagine what that must have been like? I think for all of us, our life before Christ was very much like this monster of sorts that we see living in the tombs, crying out, cutting himself with stones. Our life prior to Christ was filled with sin. But when we come to know who Jesus is, when we have faith in him, when we're obedient to his will, Jesus transforms our life. And it's so easy for us to get caught up in our transformed life and forget what things were like before. It's easy for us to just not really even think about all that Jesus has done for us because we end up going through the motions. But this story is about the power and the majesty of Jesus. And this man understands, I believe, fully what Jesus had done for him. You know, Jesus is often rejected by people who can't see his majesty. Jesus is able and he is willing to save each one of us from eternal condemnation. You know, Jesus came to seek and save the lost, Luke chapter 19 and verse 10. And that includes you and me. And we see that in Romans chapter 3, verses 10 and 23. But Jesus is often rejected by people who can't accept his majesty. You know, a prophet is not without honor except in his own hometown. If you skip over to chapter 6 of Mark's gospel, look at the first 6 verses. Listen to what he writes. He went away from there and he came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. And on the Sabbath he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astonished, saying, "Where did this man get these things? What is this wisdom, and how was it given to him? How are such mighty works done by his hands? Is not this the carpenter's son, the son of Mary, and brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?" And they took offense at him. And Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor except in his hometown and among his relatives and in his own household." And he could do no mighty work there except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them. And he marveled because of their unbelief. And he went about among the villages teaching. You know, you think about a prophet is not without honor except in his own hometown. You know, what Christ offers seems too magnificent to be true. And so many people will reject the majesty of Jesus. Many people will simply walk away. You know, really even today, it seems that we are so far removed from the miraculous that many people have concluded that it simply couldn't have happened. Some assume that Jesus' power should translate into smooth sailing for them even today, when it doesn't. And when it doesn't, they reject him and they abandon their faith. Many people believe that, well, if Jesus can do miracles, then certainly he's going to do them today for me, and he's going to make everything smooth sailing. But we know that doesn't happen in life. We know that life is challenging. And sadly, as I said, those who would hold that view at the first sign of challenge, they would reject Jesus and they abandon their faith. You know, when the storms come, many people assume that if God is not removing this storm from their life, that somehow he's forsaken them. But you go back to the end of chapter 4 in that storm story, Jesus was there in the boat with the disciples. But the truth is, being in the boat with Jesus doesn't keep the storms from coming. It just keeps us from being destroyed by the storms. That's what we need to remember. God protects us from Satan, yes, but he doesn't protect us from life. Life is filled with challenges. We need to make sure that we continue to put our faith in who Jesus is and remember his power and his majesty and acknowledge him and allow him to continue to guide us and to protect us along the way, recognizing that, yes, indeed, challenges are going to come in life, but if I'm following Jesus, I'm not going to be destroyed by them. Jesus prays in John chapter 17, verse 15, "I do not ask that you take them out of the world, but that you keep them from the evil one." God protects us from Satan, but not from life. We need to remember that being in the boat with Jesus doesn't keep storms from coming, but it keeps us from being destroyed by those storms. It's Mark chapter 6 and verse 6, where we just read, that tells us that Jesus marveled at the unbelief of the people in his own hometown. You know, it's true that the more extraordinary things are, the harder they are to believe. And I think this is why many would argue today that Jesus is simply a wise yet very human teacher. You know, they want to tone down Jesus so that, he might be more believable. Even within some churches, Jesus is toned down so that those on the outside of the church will see that teaching of a toned down Jesus and maybe be more willing to accept him. I think the truth for us is that this story asks us to believe the extraordinary. And you see this man who is demon-possessed, this man who spends his life living in the tombs, crying out, breaking chains, breaking shackles, who can't be subdued, but he's crying out and he constantly cuts himself with stones. Seeing that man go from that position to encountering Jesus and now being seen as clothed and in his right mind. That transformation that occurs when someone encounters Jesus is extraordinary. And this story in Mark chapter 5, it calls us to believe the extraordinary. And I want you to think about what Mark is doing. He's showing Jesus to be one whose power and majesty make it hard for people to accept him. That's what Mark's doing. Jesus' power and his majesty make it difficult for people to accept him. But this text begs us to ask ourselves the question, do you know what Jesus has done for you? I think when we come to really understand what Jesus has done for us, we're going to be driven into a more authentic life with God. And we're going to seek to be true disciples of Jesus. Let's remember what Jesus has done for us. Remember how far he's brought us. And let's make sure that we acknowledge his power and his majesty in all the things that we do and say. Let's make sure that we're showing others that our faith in Jesus drives us to a more authentic life with him.